The debt was $200 paid to free a bound Apache captive from the trading post cage, a decision that would change his life forever, though Emmett Hollis did not yet know her name, only that some debts come back wearing a human face. The post at Cottonwood Crossing smelled the way it always did in high summer, of cured leather and dust and old cedar smoke curling up from the stove in back, and Emmett had ridden 2 hours into that smell already knowing he could not pay what he owed. His ranch had survived one more brutal season, but only barely. Half his south fence lay in splinters from a spring windstorm that had come through in a single furious hour and left him weeks of work to show for it. 2 horses had gone lame in the same bad stretch, one from a rattler's strike and the other from a stone bruise that refused to heal clean. Every dollar he had was already spoken for by somebody else, and the number waiting for him on Ezra Whitlock's ledger, $35, ink gone brown with age from 3 seasons of postponement, sat there like a debt that fully intended to outlive him. He had grown up on that land the way a man grows up inside his own skin, without noticing it until something made it hurt. His father Thomas had broken that ground with a borrowed mule and a stubborn kind of hope back before Emmett could remember any other kind of life. And Emmett had buried him in that same dirt 3 winters back, in a plot marked only by a flat river stone because there had been no money left over for a proper headstone either. His mother had gone years before that, of a fever nobody in the territory had a name for, and Emmett had spent most of his 28 years learning the particular arithmetic of a ranch that always owed more than it earned. He had ridden to town that morning telling himself he would find some way to talk Whitlock into more time, the way he had twice before, some promise of next season's cattle money or next spring's wool. He had not expected the other kind of offer waiting for him at the counter, and he would spend the rest of his life grateful he'd been standing in that particular doorway on that particular morning. There's another arrangement. Whitlock wiped his hands on his apron in the unhurried way of a man used to being obeyed without argument, and led Emmett around the back of the post, past stacked crates and coiled rope and barrels of nails gone rusty at the rim, to a rough plank fence where several silent figures stood in the white glare of noon. Most kept their eyes fixed on the packed dirt beneath their feet, the particular stillness of people who had learned that looking up only invited more trouble. One did not lower her eyes at all. A young woman stood apart from the others with dust ground into the hem of her dress and the leather of her boots, and yet she held herself the way a lit candle holds its flame in wind, still upright, unbothered by the thing trying to put her out. Her dark eyes did not search the yard for pity. They simply watched, patient, as though she had already made her peace with something no one else standing in that yard could begin to understand. Apache girl. Whitlock let the words drop as carelessly as a man naming a mule for auction. Quiet, strong, good hands, good back, no trouble in 6 weeks of holding her. Take on her debt contract along with your own, and yours disappears entirely. Call it a settlement, Mr. Hollis, and a fair one at that. Emmett looked at her the way he would look at any person standing behind a fence built for livestock, and something in his chest went hard and cold all at once. She's a person. Whitlock only shrugged, entirely unmoved, the way a man shrugs at weather he has long since stopped arguing with. She's a contract, same as yours was an hour ago. The woman never begged. She never so much as flinched at being spoken of that way in front of a stranger, And it was that stillness, more than anything else in the whole ugly transaction, that Emmett could not look away from, as though she had decided long before that morning exactly what kind of person she intended to remain, regardless of what any ledger claimed to own of her. He wanted her name, and the silence stretched long enough that he half believed no answer would come at all. Yara. The name arrived finally, quiet but unhurried, giving him nothing more than that single word and the steady weight of her gaze. Around her neck, half hidden beneath the collar of her worn dress, something caught a single ray of sun slanting through the fence slats, a small turquoise pendant worked with fine silver lines he couldn't quite make out from that distance, wings of some kind, spread wide across a shape he took at first for a full moon. Emmett studied it only a moment before looking back to her face, and found her watching him watch it, as though she were weighing something about his character in that exact instant that he would not learn the answer to for many weeks yet. He turned back to Whitlock and set the folded debt papers flat on the counter between them. "Tear them up. Both of ours, mine and hers." Whitlock raised an eyebrow at the request, but a paying customer remained a paying customer regardless of his conditions, and he struck a match to the pages without further argument, watching the old ink curl black and crumble to nothing in the dish. Across the dusty street, an old Apache traveler leading a single pack mule had gone entirely still at the sight of the pendant catching light, and he lifted his hat from his head slow and reverent, the way a man uncovers himself before something he considers holy. He did not approach the fence, nor did he call out. He only stood a long moment in the shade of the awning across the street, watching the woman walk free of the enclosure at last, and murmured words too quiet for Emmett to catch from that distance, though any Chiricahua who might have overheard them would have understood precisely what they meant, and would have carried the news of it faster than any rider could travel, that the long-lost chief's daughter had finally been found. The 3-hour ride back to Cottonwood Valley passed in a silence that felt, oddly, less like distance than something closer to respect. Yara sat the wagon bench with her spine straight and her hands folded loosely in her lap, watching the desert scroll by with the same patient attention she'd given the trading post yard, never once glancing back the way most people freed from a bad situation might. Emmett found himself stealing glances sideways more than once, unable to name what unsettled him about a woman who seemed to owe the world nothing at all, despite everything the world had just finished doing to her. He tried twice to make idle conversation about the weather and the state of the road, and got only short, measured answers in return that closed each subject as neatly as a door. By the 3rd mile he'd stopped trying entirely, deciding a woman who had just been bought free of one cage was owed whatever silence she chose to keep, and that a man ought to have the decency to let her keep it. They passed the turnoff to his own gate as the sun dropped low and gold over the western ridge, and Yara looked at the ranch house and the sagging barn and the crooked fence line with an expression Emmett couldn't quite read. Not disappointment, not relief. Something more like a person taking careful inventory of ground she intended to make good use of. "This is your father's place." It was the first full sentence she'd offered him, unprompted the entire ride. He wanted to know how she knew that. A man does not build a fence line like this for himself alone. He builds it the way a son builds, trying to finish something someone else started. Emmett had no answer ready for that, and rode the rest of the way in silence. If you're the kind of viewer who stays for the quiet stories, tap the join button beside the channel name and become a channel member. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for a hand, and had 2 heavy grain sacks slung over one shoulder toward the barn before Emmett had even finished setting the brake. By sundown she had reorganized his feed room into some order he hadn't known it lacked, swept the stable floor clean of 3 seasons' accumulated dust, and mended a cracked water bucket with a scrap of rawhide he'd forgotten he owned entirely, all without asking him a single question about where anything belonged or ought to go. She simply looked at a thing, understood what it needed, and fixed it, moving through his neglected outbuildings the way a person moves through a room they have lived in their whole life, rather than one they had entered for the first time that same afternoon. He stood in the barn doorway that first evening and watched her work with the strange, unsettled feeling of a man watching his own house recognize a stranger faster than it had ever recognized him. Morning came and found fresh water already drawn for the horses, coffee already simmering low on the stove in a pot he hadn't taught her to use, and Yara standing at the eastern edge of the yard, with her face turned toward the coming light. The horses wake before the sun. The words were not quite for him, more for the yard itself, the way a person speaks a fact so old it no longer needs an audience. They should not have to wait on people who are still asleep. Emmett's oldest mare, a stubborn bay that had refused every hand on the ranch for the better part of 6 months, biting at strangers and shying even from him some mornings when the wind was wrong, walked to Yara's side on her own that day and lowered her head into Yara's open palm the moment Yara murmured something low and unhurried in Apache. Emmett had spent half a year trying to earn that same trust with sugar cubes, patience, and more bruised knuckles than he cared to count. It had taken her a single sentence spoken in a language the mare had clearly never once heard before. The wonders kept arriving in ways too small to explain individually and too consistent, taken together, to dismiss as coincidence. She read tracks along the dry arroyo that his own ranch hand Dell walked past twice a week without ever seeing them, of foxes crossing 3 days gone, a rider who had doubled back twice through a stand of mesquite for reasons only she seemed able to guess at. She strengthened a cracking wagon wheel with strips of rawhide she'd soaked overnight in a bucket he hadn't even noticed her fill the evening before. She showed him how to read weather 2 full days out, simply by the particular way the light sat on the western ridge at dusk. Information delivered as plainly as a person might mention the time of day. Slowly, without anyone quite marking the day it happened, the ranch itself seemed to settle, the way a nervous animal settles once it finally decides the hand feeding it means it no harm. Emmett found himself sleeping easier for reasons he couldn't have explained to another living soul. And old Dell took to tipping his hat to Yara each morning without Emmett ever having to ask him to. A pair of coyotes took to circling the calving pen one week, bold enough in their hunger to test the fence line twice in a single night, and it was Yara who woke Emmett before dawn on the 3rd night, already dressed, already moving toward the barn with a lantern in one hand and no fear at all in her bearing. She had heard them differently than he had, not the sound of the animals themselves, but the particular silence of the cattle gone still and watchful in a way that meant danger circling close. Together they drove the coyotes off before first light, and Emmett found himself more struck by her calm in the moment of real danger than by anything she had done in the quiet, ordinary days before it. The way she moved through the dark, like a person who had never once doubted her own read of a threat. Dell, when he heard the story over breakfast, only shook his head slowly, muttering that he'd take Yara's ears over any dog on the property, the highest compliment he knew how to give. What unsettled Emmett more than her competence in time was the way strangers treated her. A trader passing through with a wagon of dry goods stopped cold at the sight of her across the yard one afternoon, removed his hat, and pressed one hand flat over his heart before he'd said a single word to either of them. An old Apache woman traveling with a small band of relatives did the very same thing the following week, bowing her head to Yara as though greeting someone whose name she'd carried her whole life without ever once having met the woman herself. Yara only shook her head each time it happened, quiet and entirely unbothered by the attention. Some people remember old customs longer than they remember old faces, was the only answer the matter ever got, no matter how carefully Emmett turned the question over trying to find another way in. A neighbor named Gideon Frost rode over that same week to borrow a length of chain, and stayed long enough to watch Yara cross the yard with a coil of rope over one shoulder, and his face folded into something sour and disapproving before he'd said a word of greeting to either of them. Gideon would not quite look at Emmett directly, the way a man talks around a subject he hasn't got the nerve to name outright. "Folks in town are talking. Man ought to think careful on what kind of help he keeps close, and what the neighbors will make of it." Emmett set down the tool he was holding slow and deliberate, giving himself time to choose the words he wanted instead of the ones that came first to mind. "She's kept this ranch running better in 6 weeks than I managed alone in 6 years. Whatever the neighbors make of that is their business, not mine, and not hers." Gideon left without the chain he'd come for, and didn't come calling again that whole season, though Emmett noticed Yara had heard every word of it from the barn door and said nothing about it at all, only looked at him a moment longer than usual before she went back to her work, something unreadable and quiet passing behind her eyes. He caught proper sight of the pendant one evening when she knelt at the well, and it swung free of her collar in the lantern light. Fine silver lines shaped like an eagle's wings spread wide across a rising sun, work too delicate and too deliberate to have ever come from any trading post counter he'd passed through in his life. He wanted to know, carefully, what it was worth. She closed her hand over it gently before he'd even finished the question. "Its worth cannot be measured in money. It belonged to someone who trusted me to carry it." Nothing further came, and something quiet in her expression told him that pressing any harder would cost him more of her trust than any answer could possibly be worth to him. That night, unable to sleep, Emmett unfolded an old surveyor's map his father had kept tacked inside the cedar chest at the foot of his own bed, tracing the faded territory lines with one finger the way he had as a boy on quiet evenings, before his eyes stopped on a stretch of high desert marked simply as Chiricahua ground, a proud Apache people the old-timers in town spoke of only in the past tense now, as though they had vanished from those hills after some quarrel. Nobody in Cottonwood Crossing much cared to remember clearly or discuss aloud. He sat with the map a long while by lamplight, turning the unfamiliar name over in his mind, feeling the edges of something he couldn't yet see the whole shape of, only the outline of its shadow, falling across his own family's history. It was the map, more than anything, that sent him back to his father's cedar chest the following week, hunting through folded coats and old letters for anything that might explain the itch at the back of his mind that had settled in and refused to leave. Beneath a folded winter coat and a pair of spurs gone stiff with age and disuse, he found a leather journal he had never once opened in 3 full years, of missing the man who wrote it, the leather gone soft and dark from handling long before Emmett himself had ever touched it. The spine cracked gently when he lifted the cover, and Thomas Hollis's careful, slanting, hand-filled page after page of ordinary ranch business, feed prices, weather, a lame horse in the winter of some year Emmett barely remembered, until one entry, underlined twice in ink gone the color of dried blood, stopped his breath in his chest entirely. Rode east under orders to witness the peace meeting his father had written. The words pressed hard enough into the page that Emmett could feel the shape of them beneath his fingertips even now. It should have ended differently. Some men wanted land more than they wanted peace, and I stood by while it happened, because I did not know, in the one moment that mattered most, how to stop it in time. We left carrying supplies, and came home carrying regret instead, and I have carried that regret every single day since, though I have told no living soul the whole of what I actually saw that day. Emmett read the entry 3 times over, each time feeling the ground beneath his understanding of his own father shift a little further from wherever he'd always believed it stood firm. He remembered sitting there with the journal open on his knees, a particular evening from his boyhood, when his father had gone quiet for the better part of a week over nothing Emmett had understood at the time, refusing supper twice, and standing long hours at the fence line staring east, toward hills that held nothing a boy could see any reason to stare at. He had asked his mother once what troubled his father so, and she had only said that some men carried weather inside them that never quite passed, and that a good son learned to let a father keep his own storms private. Emmett understood now, for the first time in 20 years, exactly which storm that had been. Tucked between 2 pages further along, he found a small paper packet of dried sage gone brittle with age, and beneath it one final line written in that same careful, slanting hand. "If my son ever reads this, remember one thing above all else. A broken promise lives longer than the man who breaks it." Emmett sat with that single sentence a long while in the lamplight, the sage crumbling faintly to dust between his fingers as he turned the packet over, before he finally folded the journal shut and carried the whole heavy weight of the question to the only person on the ranch who might possibly know what any of it meant. He found Yara at the corral fence at dusk 2 evenings later and asked her carefully what she knew of a place called Chiricahua Ground, watching her face closely for whatever truth might cross it in the failing light. Every Apache child has heard that name spoken with respect. Her voice gave nothing further away, though something behind her steady eyes went very still and very far away for a long moment. When he explained, haltingly, what his father's journal had said. A peace meeting gone terribly wrong. A private regret carried silently for years, without ever once being spoken aloud to another soul. She considered it a long while before any answer came at all. Regret is honest, but it does not change what already happened, and it does not undo what was lost. She turned back toward the horses before he could press her any further, and he let her go, sensing without yet understanding why that he had brushed up against something far larger than either one of them fully grasped. In the evenings that followed, Emmett found himself lingering longer at the porch rail than any chore required, and more often than not he found Yara already there ahead of him, watching the last light drain out of the western hills with the same patient attention she gave to everything else. They talked little, and yet the quiet between them had stopped feeling like distance weeks before, and had settled instead into something closer to companionship. The easy kind two people share, when neither feels any need to fill a silence just to prove they're still paying attention. One evening she showed him how to read the coming weather in the color of the dust kicked up along the ridge, and he found himself watching her hands more than the horizon she was pointing to, and looked away quickly when she caught him at it, a small private warmth rising in his chest that he didn't have a ready name for, and didn't try very hard to find one. Neither of them spoke of it directly. Not once, but something had shifted between them all the same, quiet and unhurried as everything else about her, the kind of understanding that needed no declaration to be entirely real. 3 riders came up the road 2 weeks later on good horses, well-dressed men who didn't bother dismounting before they started talking, and Emmett knew trouble by the particular way they sat their saddles, like men accustomed to being obeyed before they'd even finished a sentence. Old Dell came out from the barn at the sound of hooves and stood a careful distance off, watchful, while the man in front, a lean, sharp-eyed rider who gave his name as Colby, unhooked a leather pouch from his belt and let it swing meaningfully in the afternoon light. They claimed Yara had run from a lawful labor contract down in the territory capital, papers filed proper and everything, and Colby's offer came smooth and practiced, the words of a man who'd made this same speech more than once before. $75, he said, double what her paper was worth by any honest reckoning, and cheap at the price for a rancher who wanted no lasting trouble over one runaway. Emmett looked past the man to where Yara stood at the porch rail, arms folded, giving away nothing at all of what she felt in that moment. "Did anyone force you to come here with me?" It came low, meant only for her over the horses shifting in the yard. She held his gaze a long moment before answering. Would my answer matter to them at all? Not a plea, not fear in her voice, only a plain fact she seemed to have already made her peace with long before that particular afternoon arrived. She did not beg him to choose one way or the other. She simply stood and waited and trusted him entirely with whatever he decided next, the way a person trusts a bridge they have already committed to walking across, regardless of what lies beneath it. Colby pressed the point further, listing the trouble that could follow a man who harbored another's rightful property, the fines, the visits from men with less patience than himself, the general unpleasantness that tended to find ranchers who made themselves difficult over matters that weren't rightly their concern. Emmett let him finish every word of it without interruption. watching the man's face the whole while for whatever truth might be hiding underneath the threat. Colby finally ran out of words. "You've had your piece. Now I'll have mine." He took the pouch of coins from Colby's outstretched hand, weighed it once in his own palm as though genuinely considering it, and then pressed it back into the man's grip hard enough that Colby's horse shifted uneasily beneath him. "I do not buy people, and I do not sell them either. Whoever decided a person could be treated like property made this world a good deal harder long before I ever arrived in it, and I don't intend to make it any easier for the men still doing the deciding today." One of the two riders flanking Colby shifted in his saddle as if to reach for something at his belt, and for one long, taut second, the whole yard seemed to hold its breath, Dell going rigid by the barn door, and Yara not moving so much as an inch from the porch rail. Colby raised a single hand without turning, and the man settled back, and the moment passed as quickly as it had arrived, though Emmett felt the whole of it settle cold in his stomach afterward, a reminder of exactly how close that particular afternoon had come to going a very different way. Colby's jaw tightened at that, his practiced smoothness slipping for just a moment. But something in Emmett's stillness, the very same stillness Emmett had first admired in Yara at the trading post fence weeks before, told him plainly that this was not a negotiation he stood any chance of winning with coin alone. The three riders wheeled their horses and started east, without another word passing between them, though the last of them turned briefly in his saddle before the trail bent out of sight behind the ridge. "Others are coming." Not quite a threat, and not quite a warning, thrown back over his shoulder. Who care a good deal more about who she really is than what she's worth written down on any paper? Emmett watched the dust of them settle slowly over the road, then turned to find Yara's expression had changed for the first time since the day he'd met her behind that fence. Not relief exactly, but something closer to quiet respect, as though he had passed some test she had been silently administering ever since Cottonwood Crossing, and had not truly expected him to pass. Before this story rides any further, if you'd like to support more frontier tales like Yara's, become a channel member and tap Join beside the channel name. It's a small thing on your end that keeps stories like hers being told well. For 3 nights after the riders left, Emmett slept badly, waking at every small sound the wind made against the shutters, though he could not have said with any certainty exactly what he was waiting for in the dark. On the 4th night he saw them from the porch, small points of firelight strung along the eastern horizon in a line too straight, too disciplined to belong to wandering travelers or a passing trade caravan making its slow way west. He counted the fires from the porch rail until the number stopped meaning anything useful to him, and somewhere behind him he heard Yara's footsteps stop dead in the doorway, and knew from the particular quality of her stillness that she'd been expecting this moment far longer than he had ever suspected. By sunrise the fires had become riders, more than 400 of them by Dell's disbelieving count, moving into the valley in a silence so complete that Emmett could hear his own heartbeat clearly over the sound of their approach across the open ground. They stopped 100 yards short of the house without a single word passing between any of them. No weapons raised, no voices calling out across the distance. Only stillness, the kind of disciplined and patient quiet that spoke louder to Emmett than any war cry ever could have. At the front of that silent tide rode an old man in finely beaded buckskin, a feathered mantle draped across his shoulders, catching the early light, seated on a gray horse that seemed to understand precisely how slowly its rider wished to move through that morning. The old man dismounted alone and crossed the last stretch of open ground on foot, unhurried. And Emmett watched Yara walk out to meet him without being asked, her spine straight in a way he now understood had never once truly left her, not even standing behind that trading post fence weeks before. The old man stopped before her and pressed one hand flat over his own heart. "My daughter." Those two quiet words landed on Emmett like a physical blow, rearranging everything he thought he had understood about the calm, capable woman who had spent 2 whole months mending his fences and gentling his horses without ever once asking for more than a roof and honest work. This was Nantan Gray Elk, chief of the Chiricahua people, and Yara, his own daughter, and the one chosen among all their people to lead them after him, had been standing quietly in Emmett's barn the entire while, saying nothing of who she truly was. Her pendant caught the morning sun as she turned toward her father, the silver eagle across its rising sun flashing bright enough to see clearly from 100 yards off, and every rider behind the chief lowered his head at once in a single unbroken wave of motion, an entire assembled nation bowing to the very woman half of Cottonwood Crossing had assumed for weeks was nothing more than a hired hand working off a debt. Emmett stood rooted at his own porch rail beside Dell, who had gone entirely silent for once in his life, understanding for the first time the full weight of the stillness he had mistaken across 2 whole months for simple obedience rather than the bearing of a woman born to lead. Emmett noticed, in the strange suspended quiet of that moment, small details he would remember for the rest of his life. The way the beadwork on the chief's mantle caught the early sun in patterns too fine to have been rushed. The way the riders behind him sat their horses without a single one shifting or murmuring, despite the long ride that clearly lay behind them. The particular hush of 400 people who had traveled a great distance for exactly this reunion and intended to let it unfold with the dignity it deserved rather than rushing toward it. Dell, beside him, had gone paler than Emmett had ever seen him, muttering something under his breath about never having seen the like in all his years on the frontier, and Emmett found he could only nod, having no better words of his own to offer. Chief Gray Elk turned to Emmett next, studying him a long moment with eyes that seemed to weigh far more than his years alone could account for, and the words that followed undid something in Emmett that had lain knotted tight ever since the night he'd first read his father's journal by lamplight. The peace meeting years ago, the chief told him, speaking slowly enough that every word landed with its full weight, had indeed been betrayed by men greedy for land, but not by every man who had ridden east that day under those same orders. One among them had refused to look away when the betrayal began to unfold, and had instead risked his own life helping several Chiricahua elders escape the ambush that followed, carrying one of them, an infant, the chief's own infant daughter, safely back across dangerous, hostile ground to her family under cover of darkness, at considerable risk to himself. That man's name, watched carefully for how it would land on Emmett's face, had been Thomas Hollis. Emmett's knees very nearly failed him where he stood. His father had spent 3 years of ordinary ranch business and quiet suppers, never once mentioning that he had saved a life that terrible day, carrying only the guilt of believing he hadn't done nearly enough, shouldering the shame of a betrayal he had never actually committed, as though it belonged to him alone to bear for the rest of his days. The Chiricahua, the chief told him plainly, had remembered Thomas Hollis very differently than Thomas had remembered himself all those years, not as a man who had failed them in their hour of need, but as the one honest witness among many who had chosen conscience over comfort when it would have been so very much easier simply to ride home afterward and say nothing at all to anyone. Yara stepped forward then and spoke for the first time since her father's arrival in the valley, her voice steady in a way Emmett had never quite heard from her before, not even at the trading post fence weeks earlier. Her eyes stayed on his the whole while. "I kept who I was hidden from you on purpose. I wanted to know who you truly were before you knew who I was. If I had arrived at your gate wearing the clothes of a chief's daughter, you would have shown me honor only because of my name and my father's standing. Instead, you showed me honor when you believed, in your own heart, that I had none of either to my name at all." Emmett understood, standing there in his own dooryard with 400 silent riders watching the two of them, that she had given him something rarer by far than simple gratitude. She had let him prove, without ever once knowing, he was being quietly tested. Exactly the kind of man he actually was underneath everything else. Chief Gray Elk announced then, before the whole gathered line of his assembled people, that the Hollis name would no longer be spoken among the Chiricahua with sorrow, as it had been for the better part of a generation now, but with gratitude instead from that morning forward, a debt of old dishonor finally balanced at last by a debt of quiet kindness paid forward by the very son of the man who had first tried, in his own small way, to pay it decades before. The riders behind him murmured low in agreement at the words, a sound like wind moving steadily through dry grass across the whole valley. And Emmett found he had no words ready of his own for a moment of this size, only the strange, hollowed-out feeling of a man watching an old family wound close over cleanly at long last. Yara reached up and unclasped the turquoise pendant from around her own neck then, the very one she had guarded so fiercely and so quietly since the day Emmett first saw it flash behind a trading post fence, and pressed it gently into his open hands before he fully understood what she meant to do with it. "Keep this until your last day on this earth. It will remind every generation of your family that one honest act of kindness can heal a wound that regret alone never could, no matter how long a man carries it." Emmett closed his fingers slowly around the warm stone, feeling the full weight of it settle into his palm like something far heavier than metal and turquoise had any earthly right to be. She turned to go, already stepping back toward the waiting line of her father's riders, and Emmett found his voice at very nearly the last possible moment before the distance between them grew too great. "Will I ever see you again?" The question came out rougher than intended, carrying more inside it than he'd meant to reveal in front of 400 silent witnesses gathered across his own yard. Yara paused mid-step and looked past him, out toward the horizon where the desert met the first blue shadow of the distant mountains, and something in her face softened into an expression he had not once seen from her before that morning. Not quite a smile, but close enough to one that he would carry the memory of it with him for a very long while afterward. The world grows smaller after forgiveness. The roads have a way of crossing again in time. Nothing further came beyond those words, and he understood, watching her walk steadily back to her father's side across the open ground, that she meant it exactly as much as she had said, and not one word further than that. An honest answer from a woman who had never once, in 2 whole months spent quietly under his roof, told him a single thing she did not fully mean. The assembled riders turned as one great body and moved east into the shimmering morning distance together, the sound of 400 horses fading slowly into the ordinary quiet of an Arizona sunrise, until the valley held nothing at all but settling dust and the particular kind of silence that follows something enormous, passing clean through a small, unremarkable place. If any part of Yara's story has stayed with you this far, consider becoming a channel member and tapping the join button beside the channel name. Weeks passed, and the ranch settled slowly back into its ordinary rhythms, cattle still needing to be moved, fences still needing mending, a stubborn old bay mare who still, on the quietest mornings, walked to the eastern fence line and stood facing the sunrise the exact way she had once been gently taught to. Emmett hung the turquoise pendant on a nail above his own ranch gate, where every rider coming or going would pass directly beneath it, a small stone catching the morning light the same way it once had behind a trading post fence, though it meant something entirely different now to anyone in Cottonwood Crossing who understood the fuller story sitting quietly behind it. Travelers passing through occasionally asked him about it, curious at a plain stone hung with such evident care, and he told them only the plain truth of how it came to hang there at all. A debt his own father hadn't known he'd already paid, settled at last by a chief's daughter who never once let a single soul know who she truly was, until the precise moment it no longer mattered to either of them. Emmett rode out to the eastern boundary of his land not long after, alone, and sat his horse a long while looking toward the hills where the Chiricahua riders had vanished that morning, trying to settle in his own mind everything that had changed in the space of a single sunrise. He thought of his father standing at that same fence line decades before, staring east at hills that had held a secret Thomas Hollis carried alone for the rest of his life, and understood now what that particular silence had cost the man, not guilt over a wrong committed, but the quieter, heavier weight of a good deed never spoken aloud, a kindness the world never knew to credit him for. Emmett resolved, sitting there with the morning still cool around him, that he would not make his own father's mistake of carrying a good thing silently until it became indistinguishable from shame. He would tell the story plainly, whenever anyone asked, exactly as it had happened. Old Dell took to telling the story himself down at the mercantile whenever a stranger asked after the pendant over the gate, embellishing it a little more with each telling the way good stories tend to grow in a small town, though the heart of it never once changed, no matter how many times it got repeated over a counter. Whitlock, for his part, stopped selling debt contracts of any kind within the year, a change nobody in town ever asked him to explain, and he never once volunteered a reason for, though more than one neighbor noticed the fence out behind his post had quietly come down for good. Cottonwood Crossing itself seemed, in small and mostly unspoken ways, a slightly more careful place after that particular season passed, the way a town sometimes learns a lesson without anyone standing up to formally teach it one. Nearly a year on, a Chiricahua rider passed through Cottonwood Crossing on his way to trade at the far side of the territory, and stopped long enough at Emmett's gate to share news he thought the rancher would want carried to him, that Yara had taken up much of her father's work already, riding out to settle disputes between bands with the same quiet, unhurried patience Emmett remembered from his own barn, and that her people spoke of her now the way they had once spoken only of her father, with a respect that had grown rather than dimmed with the responsibility she'd taken on. The rider offered no message from her directly, only the news itself, delivered plainly and without ceremony, and Emmett found that it was enough, that he did not need more than that to know she was exactly where she was meant to be, doing exactly the work she had always been suited for. Emmett thought of Yara often in the seasons that followed, in the particular way a man thinks of weather that changed the whole shape of his year, without ever once asking his permission to do so. He did not know, on most ordinary mornings, whether the road she had spoken of would truly ever cross his own again, only that he had stopped needing a certain answer to that question in order to keep living well by everything she had quietly taught him during her short time under his roof. That dignity could never once be bought at any price a man could name, and that the finest kind of honor was always the sort a person showed you when they believed no one at all was watching them, and no one was keeping any kind of score. Some debts he had come to understand fully were never truly paid in gold to begin with. They were paid instead in the plain, ordinary decision to treat another human being as though their worth had never once been in serious question. And Emmett Hollis, standing most mornings beneath a turquoise pendant that caught the light of every fresh sunrise from that season onward, understood at last exactly what his own father had been trying so quietly to tell him from beyond the grave, that a kindness kept faithfully long enough will always, in its own good time, find its way home again.